So there was a request to do part 2 of exploring and inquiring into how to understand ourselves as part of nature and not separate from it. Or an identity that is separating rather than inclusive. And I just want to say again, as I said before, that doesn't mean not honoring our expressions in the diversity of being queer, transgender, non-conforming, bi, lesbian, and gay. So we're talking about something different. So we, we considered in the last talk the expression of ignorance, this movement in confusion to try and locate something to anchor into, because the experience of ignorance is not to fit in. In fact, ignorance is what's called dukkha, or suffering. And the definition of suffering in Pali, in the Abhidhamma, is the what is it that goes into the middle of a wheel? The axle. The axle going into the middle of a wheel and not fitting properly. So it's like that sense of not fitting in, not fitting properly, and the stress that happens from the constant wear of that. Out of that not fitting in and confusion also comes, right, and we've really woven that into a theme over these weeks, the experience of insufficiency and isolation and homelessness, feeling like we don't fit anywhere, we don't fit in anywhere, and we don't even fit into ourselves, that nothing is fitting or grooving easily. And out of that confusion and those experiences, the mind reaches out either towards our internal experience or outside to hold on to and to grasp something, to own, to control, to try and fit in, but in all the ways that actually bring suffering rather than the end of suffering, right? So that's a little bit of what we were saying, and that the sense of owning and taking experience as me and mine in that context is very understandable. And then dependent origination, this analysis in a more detailed process of what are those steps in ownership, like what's actually taking place moment after moment. The Buddha is explicit and never wavering in saying that the movement of the mind in wanting or clinging or holding on or owning will always bring suffering, that the nature of that movement of the mind and the consequence of that energy is to bring suffering. So he said in the First Noble Truth, which is the sort of foundation of the teachings, there is suffering in life. And then in the Second Noble Truth, he said, and this is the cause of it, this clinging, wanting, desiring. And then the third noble truth is that actually there's also liberation from it, that it is possible to free ourselves from this dynamic. And then the fourth is the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is the path that, when practiced, realizes the third noble truth, which realizes freedom and liberation. That is, that there is an ending to that wanting and clinging. And there is an ending to its opposite, which is not wanting and hating and anger and fear. And there's an ending to the root of that, which is ignorance and confusion and all those psychological expressions of that ignorance. There is an ending to all of that. And the ending happens in different traditions. It's described differently. In the Theravadan tradition, it's described in different stages. But however it's described, and the outcome is the same. So last night, Brent and Mel and I were hanging out a little bit after our evening, and Brent mentioned, oh yeah, you quoted Tulku Oregon Rinpoche, who's considered who was considered a fully enlightened being, and he was the father of Tsoknyi Rinpoche, Mingo Rinpoche, and Choki Nyima Rinpoche. He had 4 sons who all followed him, or not followed him, but were called to the path as well. And he actually gave them instructions, all of them. And Brent reminded me of the story, which I really love, which is when he was clearly dying. And Tsoknyi, the second son, said, look, I think he always called him Rinpoche. Rinpoche, you should rest, because Rinpoche was sitting by the window and there was a long line of people waiting to see him for an interview. And Rinpoche refused. He said, no, they want to see me, and I want to honor that. And so he saw, I don't know how many people. And then at one point he said to Tsoknyi, now I'm ready to rest. And he went and sat on his bed in a meditation posture and died. And I feel so moved by that story, because it was such an expression of a heart extending itself in caring and generosity without any self-referencing. And there are many expressions of a mind and heart that are free of clinging and ignorance. And that's one of short story of one. So it is, so that's the third noble truth. And the Eightfold Path is, because I don't think I actually have enunciated it in these 10 days or 11 days or however many days it's been, is skillful understanding, correct understanding, and then skillful intention, and then skillful action, skillful speech, skillful livelihood, skillful effort, skillful mindfulness, and skillful concentration. And sometimes that the word that's used is right understanding, right intention. But right and wrong have a lot of baggage with them. So just skillful, that what is conducive to the end of suffering is what's skillful. And in skillful understanding, which is the first of the links, is this teaching on dependent origination. And the Buddha said it was impossible to have skillful understanding about the liberation process without understanding dependent origination. So it's considered a core teaching in our tradition, insight meditation tradition. So I would like to read the different links. Oh, I hope I brought them. Oh, did I leave a critical piece of my paper? I know them anyway. Oh, here. Okay, so in these 12 links, we can come in at any point. It's not like you always have to start at one place, but traditionally it begins with ignorance. And then ignorance conditions karmic formations. So this conditioning process is at the heart of what differentiates selfing and ownership from being part of nature, because we understand that nature is dependent on conditions. If there isn't any water, a tree won't grow. Or when we talked a little bit about karma in the beginning of this part of our retreat, I mentioned if it's an apple seed, an apple tree will grow, that there's certain conditions which give rise to something else, and that everything in nature is conditional. And that's a key understanding, that unless we're talking about the unconditioned state, which or an arahant after they die, everything is conditioned. So, and because everything is conditioned, it means everything is dependent on everything else. So the core of dependent origination says, if this happens, that happens. And if that happens, this happens. That is, one thing is dependent on the other. And it's so obvious, really, because we're dependent on food to live, and water and air, and so many other things. And when we really consider the interrelatedness of those dependent conditions, we get to see that there's nothing outside of that. There isn't anything that you can separate from those dependent conditions and make into a separate I. This is free of dependent conditions. And if it isn't free of dependent conditions, it's everything is dependent on everything else, where is the I? Except for misunderstandings, just conceptual and confused misunderstandings. So, you know, just to give a very literal example, if I own a piece of land, and because I own it, I think I can clear cut it, without really understanding how, because it's clear cut, the soil is washed off into the rivers, and then that soil clogs the rivers up and it destroys the fish. And so people lose their living. And so there's a mass migration into the cities. And because we don't discern the world when there's a sense of ownership in the context of those conditions, it's very difficult not to be harmful, because we're not seeing the relationship and the impact of what's happening. In fact, you know, the relationship of ownership precludes respect, love, and freedom. And I mentioned that in the Dhamma talk, so I'm just emphasizing that again. When husband owned their wives, they were entitled to rape them or beat them, because when you own something, that movement of the mind in that relationship to control distorts your perception and doesn't allow you to see life accurately and the interdependent nature of it and the beauty of it. So these links are links which explicitly talk about how a set of links condition something. So everything is conditioned. And so we're beginning with ignorance, but it doesn't have to be that. We can begin anywhere on this 12 link chain. So there's ignorance, which conditions karmic formations. And karmic formations are I would say they're the combination of genetic and cultural conditioning that skews the thinking in habitual ways. So we can include white supremacy in that. We can include anti-Semitism in that, and all the skewed generational passing on of how to perceive and understand the world. And it's always conditioned. So it's never wisdom. It's always the karmic formations are always conditioned through that first link of ignorance. And I'll come back to it. So there's karmic formation, and then karmic formation becomes the grounds for consciousness to arise. And then consciousness becomes the ground for mental and physical existence to arise. And I'll talk about all these later. And then that becomes the condition for the six sense organs to arise. That becomes the condition for contact. That becomes the condition for the feeling of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. That becomes the condition for craving. Craving becomes the condition for clinging. Clinging becomes the condition for becoming. Becoming is the condition for rebirth. And rebirth is the condition for death. And when we're talking about rebirth and death, when in this particular explanation of the links, I'm not talking about it one lifetime to another, but the rebirth of a moment and the death of a moment. It's this is all, these links are all momentary. So talking about ignorance, then there's some very traditional definitions of ignorance, and the singular one is not seeing suffering where suffering is. And, you know, we have teachers in our world that just constantly highlight that dynamic, you know, not seeing suffering where suffering lives, and misperceiving beauty and thinking beauty is thinking that the beautiful is freedom, when the beautiful, as in all that is, feels attractive to us, actually can become the condition for craving, clinging, and ownership. So misunderstanding where our freedom lies, and in that, and being deeply confused about it. So seeing the beautiful where it isn't beautiful, not seeing suffering where it's suffering, not seeing impermanence. And seeing, that means seeing everything as permanent. And of course, believing that the self is an enduring and solid entity. And those are some of the classic expressions of the confusion or of ignorance. So this confusion of and the misperception of life gives rise to karmic formations. And there's cultural karmic formations, as I mentioned, as well as individual karmic formations. So, so it's just so clear that the way racism and sexism and the other forms of oppression are constituted out of ignorance, of wanting to sustain the power to access comfort, pleasant experiences and resources, in the misunderstanding that it can be done to endure, that things don't change, that it can be done and that actually it will bring suffering, but not being able to see that. And misunderstanding where real beauty is, where respect and honor is, integrity. So that ignorance gives rise to this misperception of how we understand the world, the sort of orientation towards the world in a particular way. And we really think when we look at a rose or another human being that we're seeing them in a neutral way. Like, oh yeah, if I see a tree this way or a rose or another human being this way, I'm seeing them as through a universal seeing, without realizing that our perception is deeply and profoundly conditioned. And when they've studied babies, they found that the way families and the culture relate to babies, it's that after 3 months, it's already gendered. So that's the impact of those karmic formations. Even before language, it's an orientation of a human being towards something. And that's the definition of karmic formations. And then that orientation calls in consciousness, a consciousness that is already oriented in a certain way. So, I think of this classic story that I've shared a number of times when I was in a place called Agunquit in Maine with my then wife or partner. And we had just had this beautiful time on the beach there, and we were walking, and we had our boogie boards on us, and just it was like one of those great days. We were holding hands because it's supposed to be queer friendly. And someone came up to us and kind of spat in our face and said, get out of town, you bloody dykes, or something like that. And I could so clearly backtrack that whole movement of the mind, that there was already ignorance there in the mind, oriented already in karmic formations, and that when he saw us, that consciousness arose as an expression of that movement, you know, directed towards us. And so that was going on in his mind. And then the consciousness begins to get embodied in name and form. And that's the next link. So you can see how everything conditions everything else. It isn't just that it suddenly comes out of nowhere. But so then that movement of the mind impacts how he moves towards us. You know, that he is moving towards us, that it's already coming into a particular type of consciousness. And then with that comes the sixth sense space, the clarification of seeing us, of us making that contact. And so, there's it comes into the sixth sense space as the body moving, as his eyes seeing us with all the stuff behind, and then this feeling. And for him, the feeling is very unpleasant. It's unpleasant to look at us, deeply conditioned. And then from that unpleasantness comes a deep not wanting. So either it's a deep wanting or it's a deep not wanting. And that not wanting isn't just a thought. It manifests, and like craving becomes clinging, not wanting gets moved into hatred, which is more embodied, more energetic expression. And then that hatred actually becomes the condition for him becoming the hater. In the same way that if we did the opposite, and it would be, let's say that, just to clarify it, as like here we are meditating, and let's just say that we have a lovely meditation experience. Let's say several, like 3 great meditations in a row. And this thought comes up, I'm really a good meditator. So there's the ignorance in that moment. There's ignorance because there's an identification happening, a movement of the mind into that orientation, not just this is an arising of ease and passing, but I am a good meditator. And then that pulls the consciousness up, that begins to define and understand that meditation as somehow belonging to me. And then the consciousness starts to get embodied in name and form. And then it's pleasant. And so the contact with that thought is very pleasant. The mind thinks, yeah, I am a good meditator. This is very pleasant. And that pleasure and that sense of, especially because it's been so hard and I am this good meditator. And then there's clinging, then there's more owning it. And in the clinging, that becomes the condition for craving and embodying it more. So then and when there's a question and answer, there's like, yes, I know what a good meditation is. And so we become the good meditator. But we all know that that's going to change, because those of us who've been meditating for a long time, and even those of us, this is your first retreat, know that it's always not going to be the same. It's always going to change. And then that's the death of it. So remember, there was the becoming a good meditator, birthing into it and then the death of it, because it's going to change. And because of that loss of, oh my God, what happened? I just was like telling everyone I'm a good meditator. Now I have to make my meditation good because I have to protect it and defend it. And so then the next meditations are hell realms because we're trying to own and control the experience. And that's true for the person who spat at our face, that it ends, we walk on. And that whole cycle means that it ends, it's a death, but then he's become more of that person who hates gay women. So those are the different steps. One step conditioning the next, conditioning the next. And so a sense of me and mine get birthed. And so remember I read that poem from the Dhammapada, and oh no, but Mel said it. Mel said it, that mind is the forerunner of all things. In suffering, these steps, anyone can be a beginning of having these steps come together. They're the forerunner of all things, the mind, and that the karmic formations and the ignorance, the karmic formations, how that brings in consciousness and how that determines the kind of contact that is made with one of the sense spaces, which determines whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, which determines clinging or aversion. And we go through that cycle 100 times a minute, but we don't notice it. So actually, let me stop there and see. Let me stop there and see, because this is, if you have any questions.
About the hell realms. Yeah. Do we really enter the hell realm? Will you say more? You mentioned
there
after
is a
the loss.
Sorry? Yeah. You said, is there a hell realm?
No, sorry, after the death, you said that we go to the hell realm, but I thought...
Oh, no, after death, we start the whole cycle again. That's what I said. No.
Okay.
No. I mean, yes, it can be an internal hell realm. Yes. Right.
That's helpful.
But no, the cycle just starts again. Yeah. I'm glad you asked. In Buddhist cosmology, there are hell realms, but mostly these days we just talk about the internal hell realm. Any other questions?
I had a little question about the consciousness part.
Yeah.
Is that meaning when it comes in our mind? What's the...
Consciousness is a very basic knowing, and it arises with all these different mental factors. So, remember there's 7 factors that are always universal: contact, feeling, volition, and some kind of basic awareness and life force. So those are always there. And then there's either ignorance and all those unwholesome mind states, or there's faith and mindfulness and all the wholesome mind states. So consciousness carries all those mental heart energies in them. And so, and it's arising and passing away and arising and passing away. And it's we think of consciousness as neutral, but actually when consciousness arises, it's always in response to the ignorance or karmic formations. That determines the orientation of the mental factors and how perception happens in each moment of consciousness. I forgot to mention perception as one of the universals. So there's always perception in every moment of consciousness. So I just want to, you both maybe have heard, or all three of you, I don't know how much you know, that there's consciousness arises in each moment through one of the sense spaces. So either there's eye consciousness, nose consciousness, thought consciousness with the mind, body consciousness, which knows touch, ear consciousness, which knows listening. So the 6 sense spaces. And so what this is saying is that consciousness isn't neutral, but determined, already oriented in a particular way. And so which explains how cultural conditioning happens, because the ignorance in cultural conditioning affects the way consciousness arises at one of those spaces. Does that make sense? So, going back to the man in a Gankwet, he thought he was seeing us neutrally and that we were bad, unaware that his perception had already been distorted by karmic formations and ignorance. So this umbrella of abandoning the unwholesome and cultivating the wholesome is an umbrella for looking at, well, what happens? What happens when there are unskillful or unwholesome energies that have been conditioned into how we think, perceive, and then act out. And this is breaking it down into stages. Does that make sense?
Irina?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about feeling tones? About pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant or unpleasant? I sometimes have a hard time figuring out whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And if it draws my attention away from my object of meditation, then it's not neutral, right? Then it's either one or the other. But sometimes, I really spend some time on it, and I know it happens just like that. And so,
yeah. But not necessarily, Jean. So there is pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral happening in every moment of consciousness, right? And so,
based on the contact with consciousness rising.
Right, but even before that, the way it becomes pleasant or unpleasant is determined by ignorance and karmic formations. Like I'm sure that that perception of us and the hatred that which was unpleasant for that man, it wasn't just neutral. Like the unpleasantness wasn't just neutral. Oh, this happens to be unpleasant. It's linked to those other conditions. and that it, and that, you know, sometimes it isn't predominant. It isn't that it's always dominant. Sometimes it's more neutral, and that's just, you know, neither pleasant nor unpleasant, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And that if there's ignorance in the mind, that's the condition for confusion. If there's mindfulness in the mind, then it's noticing what is whatever is the dominant experience, if it isn't pleasant.
But say a jet flies over, and so sound consciousness rises, and you know, kind of unpleasant because it's using all that fuel and kind of a noise, but neutral because it's not that bad.
Well, that's a great example, Jean. Let's go through it. You're sitting, you hear the noise, and if you are a little attached to your object of experience, the breath, then it's already going to be a little unpleasant.
Because it's drawing me away.
Attachment, right, which is because there was in the attachment was already, we could put it in the frame of ignorance, karmic formation, sound, unpleasant, because there was a little clinging to the object of meditation. And then that gives rise to the thinking process.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's what's so great about it, is that, you know, when you know this, when you know, is to sort of really discern, like to go back and to say, oh, yeah, that wasn't just like neutrally unpleasant, although some things can be, like cold is unpleasant to me often, and some of you enjoy cold, so that's just an inherited predisposition.
Okay.
And the different personalities we have, greedy, aversive, and deluded personalities. The personalities are because we've had so many of these particular dependent origination cycles happening that it gets solidified into a personality. So some of us are always seeing what's unpleasant, not because it is, but because we've been believing those messages, like this man in a gunquit. It might be safe to assume that his parents taught him that, like just inheriting perceptions that are unpleasant.
Thank you.
Yes.
Arina,
Dali.
could you, thank you. Could you go over the links again a little slower? It was a little fast for me. And also, especially the last steps when it's like death and rebirth, I think I didn't understand that at all.
Okay. So first there's ignorance, this misunderstanding. Then there's karmic formation, which is the first movement of that misunderstanding into some form. And then that form becomes the condition that determines the kind of consciousness that arises. Because what we're saying is that consciousness isn't neutral. It's already oriented towards something. So remember when I talked about karma, and I said karma is the gathering, the will gathers the energy towards something. So this is a description of that gathering and orienting towards a particular goal. This movement from karmic formation into consciousness. So consciousness are the constitutive capacities to interact internally or externally with the world, but are not neutral. So that's consciousness. And then from consciousness is mental and physical existence, which is, it means that it's becoming more embodied then. It's just living more in the body. And then it is experienced through one of the sense spaces directly. So let's say that, let's go back to the meditator. And there are these, very pleasant experiences, and already some movement of the mind is going towards them. And that movement of the mind is becoming more embodied until the thought, which is the contact with the sense space of mind, comes up, I'm a good meditator. So it's this movement into embodying either what's skillful or unskillful. In this case, with the meditator, I'm a good meditator. That contact, that thought, that's the thought, making contact with the thought, I'm a good meditator. It's pleasant. The thought is pleasant. So then after the sixth sense space and the feeling of being pleasant comes craving. I like that. I'm moving towards it even more. And from craving, we keep going on. Yes, I am happy to embody. I'm a good meditator, because really I felt like I was a bad meditator. Now I see that I'm really a good meditator. So really owning it. So that movement of owning it. So after that, like really going towards it and attaching towards it, I am a good meditator. The thought, going towards it, holding on to it, move, and then becoming it. And that's the becoming. And then I have birthed myself. So I've become it, and I've birthed myself into this being who's a good meditator. And if I happen to have a lot of ease in my meditation, and let's say it's a 3-month retreat, you could imagine, unless you go to a teacher and you talk about it, and then the teacher might intervene. But if you don't, but you can imagine after 3 months how you have birthed yourself, rebirthed yourself into being a good meditator, and how solid that could become until something difficult comes that intervenes, which at some point it will. And then that's the death. That the impermanence of conditions in life mean we cannot make anything permanent, because the conditions are always changing. Yes, Lindy.
Is the contact always with a thought?
No, contact could be with eyes, it could be hearing, it could be tasting, it could be body touch, it could be smelling. It's any one of the sense spaces. Contact is any one of the sense spaces. So if you see a rose and it's attractive, and you're with a friend at a park, and you're already going to something that looks beautiful, and then the contact is smell. Oh, that the ignorance is, oh, look at that rose, and you've just been so irritated, and now you're looking at that rose, and it's like you're really embodied and moving towards the rose, and you smell it, and that's a contact. Or the contact is sight. You're seeing it. Oh, the rose comes into your vision, and because you're already on that, cruising, that you're going to the bar and cruising, when we were young, of course. That kind of like, you could tell when people were cruising, that kind of, even if they were cruising behind you, you could feel how they were looking at you, right? That energy, that looking energy, before you even see the rose, that's ignorance. That energy fall into place. So what we're saying is that contact is most often not neutral. I mean, sometimes the Buddha says it is, but most often contact is either you're in ignorance or you're in the skillful mindfulness, faith, patience, the Eightfold Step wiring, one or the other. Mostly ignorance. And then we see that in the world.
Can you give an example of if you were mindful walking and you saw the rose?
Then you would see form and color, and it could be pleasant, and you would notice the pleasantness. You would feel the happiness, you would notice the happiness, and then you would walk away, and then you would notice what the next experience is without any of the clinging. So there could, and then you would notice the joy. And if you really were meditating, then you could notice the joy as a condition for collecting the mind and go through the beautiful factors of
would you be
collecting
aware?
concentration.
Would you be aware of the karmic formations that made you walk to the rose?
Yes, I think sometimes we are, just depending how much we're into the cruising of wanting something to distract us from how we're feeling. You know, that like looking out, I want something, the way, that kind of hardness in the way we're looking. And then there's the rose. Oh, let's go and have a look at the rose, you know? So yeah, because when there isn't the cruising feeling, it's much more receptive and open.
Oh,
like,
okay.
oh, I'm not looking for anything already.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a rose. Oh, lovely. Let's, meet and greet the rose. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a whole different energy. Yeah. In fact, this only happened to me once when I was on a 3-month retreat. I was sitting at a chair looking out the window, and I'm short-sighted. And my eyes were so relaxed that I actually saw everything clearly without my glasses. And I told the optometrist that, and he said, that's impossible. But it was. It was amazing. But then I could never, of course, repeat it again. I definitely tried. So then I did just want to, before I come to an end, I did just want to read out the alternative cycle. Okay, so the alternative cycle, remember we talked about wise reflection. So let's take contemplating the beautiful qualities of the Buddha or reflecting on the Dhamma. And as we do, there's this, the mind is contained in being ethical, in not the Buddha being cognizant of that there's no harming in the mind. And that no harming gives rise to faith. And faith gives rise to gladness of heart. And gladness of heart conditions, or can condition rapture. And rapture can condition the collectedness of the mind into calm. And calm becomes, or can become, the condition for happiness. And happiness can become the condition for concentration. And concentration then becomes the condition for insight. And insight becomes the condition for disenchantment. So being able to let go. Like, what the hell am I hanging on to? It's all coming and going. I see that through insight, that there's impermanence and no self and unsatisfactoriness. And from that disenchantment, equanimity strengthens, just the deep non-reactivity of the mind, and equanimity then becomes the condition, or can become the condition, for the mind jumping into the unconditioned, for liberation. So that's called the alternative wheel, or the radiant wheel. But traditionally, the dependent origination is the support for us to really challenge how we're perceiving things, to intervene then. Or if we don't catch it in the distortion of perception, catching whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And if we don't catch the experience of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, then catching the automatic response of wanting or not wanting, or going into confusion. So just to take a moment to embody that part again. So if we were all going to a party together, and Mary opens the door, and some of us are the greedy type, and so we're looking in the room, and the greedy types are saying, oh my God, yes, great, they have hors d'oeuvres, and I love that music, and Janie and Jacob are there. So just seeing what's pleasant and going for what's pleasant, moving towards what's attractive, right? So intervening in that. Or the aversive people are, I can't just believe they're serving hors d'oeuvres and not a whole meal at 7 p.m. And wow, that music is so noisy. And oh, wow, I just don't know if I want to go into this party. So that's the aversion. So aversive people see what's unpleasant. And the thing is, we're seeing what's neutral, but it's so skewed already. And deluded people, so the deluded people in our gang are like, whose party is this? Where are we? Like just confused, the mind is confused. So then looking at the radiant circle, so the greedy people through practice develop faith and generosity. And the aversive people develop wisdom. And because aversive people see the details of what's unpleasant. So very like that cutting mind. Aversive people are I speak from experience. And deluded people have a ease in developing equanimity. So it's good to know that. So anyway, so we all think we are seeing the party as it is, but it isn't. We're seeing through our personality types, which come from having identified many times in this looking at the world in that particular way. And so the Buddha says, notice that. Notice how you are discerning and perceiving life. And notice the pleasant and unpleasantness of it without going towards greed, hatred, or confusion. And that's why he talks so much about pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Noting it, because if we don't, we automatically go into those reactions. And then the dependent origination cycle begins, craving, clinging, becoming. In what's attractive, or like that guy in the Gankwat, what isn't attractive? Okay, wow. Well, thank you all so much for being willing to hang in there. And I wanted to read one of my, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had one more question, but do you not have time?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was just curious about the deluded person. how they get to equanimity, because that seems like a long road.
And through focus. So
Oh.
the practice for greedy people is renunciation. And the Buddha said greedy people should live in unattractive hovels with broken bowls and torn clothes. So basically not feeding your greed, relinquishing the wanting, and because seeing attractive things triggers greed. So you should be careful not to keep triggering your greed. Aversive people should live in beautiful surroundings so that their aversion isn't triggered. So they should have silks. He said many silks, colorful silks. And deluded people, he didn't say, he said deluded people should live somewhere where they have a large view of the world. So so two things, that deluded people should practice focusing and also should practice being in spaces where they have a large view so they can discern things more clearly. And I guess focus and having a big view together bring a lot of equanimity. And so the practice for greedy people is renunciation. The practice for aversive people is loving kindness. And the practice for deluded people is focus.
And is there a sutta for that?
That comes from a lot of different suttas, and particularly the Visuddhimagga. The path of purification. Yeah.
Okay.
May I ask?
The commentaries on the teachers. Yeah.
Can we be all of them?
Well, we definitely all have 3 of them, but one is usually predominant.
Mm.
Just ask a good friend, they'll tell you. Should I end with a poem? Or maybe it's enough. It's late already. Maybe it's enough. Maybe we'll just take, oh no, it isn't enough. Okay, this is my favorite poem. One of my favorite poems, of course there are many, called For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet by Joy Harjo. Put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off that cell phone, computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath, offered by the friendly winds. They travel the earth, gathering essences of plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars' ears and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream, planting itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasin feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time, who will be there after time. They sit before the fire that has been there without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial insecure jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for the harm we humans have brought down upon them. Don't worry. The heart knows the way through. There may be high-rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you a few hours, a day, a year, a few years, 100,000 or even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense human feast set by the thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, sage, or other healing plants. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go the pain you are holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, all the way to your feet. Let go the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are heading in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. These helpers take many forms: animal, element, bird, angel, saint, stone, or ancestor. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as you would to a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces, in tatters. Gather them together. They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it's bathed and given clean clothes. Now you can have a party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place else to go. Make a giveaway. And remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, thank you.